So hello and welcome to the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre's Tuesday Talks, aptly named because we hold a talk every Tuesday. My name is Natalie and I work at the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre. So good morning, good afternoon and good evening to you all wherever you're joining us tonight. For this evening's Tuesday talk, Death, Near-Death, DMT, and Discarnate Entities. Just before I introduce our speaker, I'm going to go ahead and mute some of you. We do ask that you stay muted throughout the talk until the end. We'll open up to Q&A. So just to introduce Dr. David Luke, he is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Greenwich. I've been told different things in the last 5 minutes. His research focuses on transpersonal experiences, anomalous phenomena, and altered states of consciousness, especially via psychedelics. When he's not running clinical drug trials with LSD, conducting DMT field experiments, or observing apparent weather control with Mexican shamans, he directs the Ecology, Cosmos, and Consciousness Salon and is a co-founder and director of Breaking Convention, the International Conference on Psychedelic Consciousness. Dr. Luke has a few things to say about the Breaking Convention, and I'll go into that a little later as well. And are you there, Dr. Luke?
I think I am.
Can we see you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction, Natalie. And thank you to Scott and, of course, Lance for inviting me, and to the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, and to all of you as well for coming out on such a cold night, is what I usually say at least, or staying at home on a cold night. So that's just as well. So I'm going to just, it's going to be some slides to accompany this talk. And if I'll just plop those up, I may disappear slightly, but you should still be able to see most of me. There we go, but a bit smaller. So I'll begin. So that's the title of the talk, The Trip of a Lifetime, Death, Near-Death, DMT, and Discarnate Entities. And I'll continue very briefly with the introduction of myself. It's not all about me, however, but I will be giving a bit of a personal story as well. So yes, I'm honorary senior lecturer at Imperial College as well. They have the world's first Centre for Psychedelic Research. So this is very much part of the current renaissance of interest in psychedelic research globally. I also have just started a course. It's about to kick off in mid-February, the first kind of educational of its kind, a professional certificate course in psychedelics and altered states and transpersonal psychology. That's with the Aleph Trust, who are validated by Liverpool John Moores University. And when I'm not doing all of that, I work at the University of Greenwich, or Greenwich, perhaps, as Lance might say, in London, of course, there on the Thames, at the centre of time, you might say, which is quite apt because aside from doing research on psychedelics and occasionally doing some research when I'm not on psychedelics, because it's not as much fun, I also do lots of research in parapsychology and particularly precognition, you know, the ability to access information from the future. So it quite helps being at the center of time for that kind of work, I find. And one of the things we do at Greenwich is, we have been for about 10 years now, is organizing a conference called Breaking Convention. And that is the biggest psychedelic research conference, academic conference in Europe. And it's been going about 10 years. And it's been steadily growing every couple of years as we put it on. Sometimes it takes some bizarre and interesting diversions, and you know, just coming to these events is somewhat of a transformative experience. Don't adjust your sets. Sometimes it goes really off. I wasn't expecting that. That's next year, and this is what it's got to last time actually. So it's been steadily growing, as is the research field of interest in psychedelics. But I'm mostly interested where they intersect with the study of so-called paranormal experiences or transpersonal experiences and parapsychology. So tonight I'm going to be talking to you about DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It's a very simple molecule. It's structurally very similar to serotonin. It was discovered in the 1950s in Hungary by Dr. Stephen Sara, and he was the first person to inject it into himself, and then decided to inject it into his colleagues as well at the Psychiatric Institute, and they all had rather extraordinary experiences. So DMT is quite hard to fathom. It's probably the most potent psychedelic substance known to humanity at this time on the planet. When it's smoked or ingested, it only lasts maybe 10 minutes, but the effects occur almost instantly. And various commentators have tried to describe the experience. The famous Zen Buddhist monk and psychedelic raconteur Alan Watts was kind of famed for being able to just talk endlessly. And so his colleagues, Timothy Leary and the others, decided, well, if we give him some of this, it'll shut him up. And sure enough, it did for a whole 10 minutes. And then apparently he just carried on telling the story he was telling 10 minutes beforehand when he came out of it, which was quite a phenomenal feat. But he did say, trying to kind of give a running commentary was very difficult. It was like being fired out of a barrel of an atomic cannon with Neo-Byzantine barreling at very high speed. And other commentators have suggested it's a little bit, the experience is quite a little bit like being punched in the back of the head by God. So some recent research at Johns Hopkins University in the States found that of those people who have experiences with the DMT, and the most prominent feature is at high doses encountering some kind of other being. Those people who have those experiences, of those people who are atheists before they had that experience, less than half of them remained atheist afterwards. So it's a 10-minute psychedelic experience which has the capacity to convert more than half of all atheists within the space of 10 minutes, just to give you a sense of how profound the experience is. So yes, it's usually smoked when it is taken. So some of the common features of both the psychedelic experience and with DMT are that it induces these geometric patterns that are often is a very visual experience. The first thing usually is intense geometric patterns, not usually in black and white like that, usually in extremely colorful and often assuming kind of geometric proportions, which seem to defy what we understand about the nature of dimensions and geometry. Lots of people report that the geometry has more than 3 spatial dimensions. That's quite a common experience. And it's often been interpreted and used by indigenous tribes for quite a long time, particularly in South America and also Central America, and they incorporate it often into their artwork. But one of the other experiences is that people often have associations with what they're hearing with what they're seeing, with what's known as synesthesia. So it can tend to kind of blend the senses. And so this supposedly is a Shipibo Kanibo woman's interpretation in yarn of the shaman's song. It's basically what a shaman's song looks like when you're under the influence of DMT. So maybe next. And given that it induces these experiences of extra dimensions, quite literally in the geometric sense, some artists have attempted to render that in, that experience of more than 4 dimensions onto canvas, but obviously with limited success. But it's even hard to imagine, let alone paint. So one of the most common features, of course, is the encounter with entities, as I mentioned. So Rick Strassman, when he pioneered this research, and it was actually the man responsible for starting the whole psychedelic research renaissance in the 1990s. He injected over 60 participants with DMT in a hospital facility. And he said that about half of them at high doses had encounters with these kind of other worlds and other beings. In our study, Chris Timmerson's study at Imperial, they found about 85% of people had encounters with beings, and we use an experienced group of people, and we had something like 95% of people in our study had encounters with other beings. And what those other beings may be, it tends to vary quite a lot. Sometimes they are of an insectoid variety, often praying mantises for some unknown reason. And occasionally they appear to be these kind of emotionless, gigantic praying mantises doing kind of like alien-like operations on people's brains. And that seems to be quite a common motif and has some parallels perhaps with the alien abduction phenomena experience. More commonly, however, are encounters with elves or alien-like creatures, little people of all shapes and sizes, dwarves, pixies, elves, gnomes. That's how people tend to describe them, although they don't tend to keep still long enough to be able to get a full and accurate picture of what they actually may be, as they tend to be constantly in this dynamic, shape-shifting form. What Terence McKenna called the self-transforming machine elves. But again, they also seem to pop up with some degree of commonality or frequency, but perhaps not as much as some people would suggest. In our recent study, we found maybe in the region of 20% of encounter experiences involved little people of some variety, pixies, elves, and so on. But common enough. Now, you don't necessarily have to be under the influence of DMT to encounter pixies and elves. In my own work, I was organizing a parapsychology conference in Brazil, and every night we were invited to go and see various different indigenous or local spiritual magical practitioners. And on this one occasion, on the end of the conference, we went to see the Guarani Indians, who did a tobacco ceremony for us, supposedly. But it turned out to be the single most weirdest night of my life, ultimately, as probably for everybody else there, because you know, all manner of strange and peculiar things happened that night that we couldn't quite understand. And it turns out that they'd given us something a little bit more than just tobacco. I worked out in the end it was probably brugmansia, which is from the tree datura, a very different substance to DMT. But nevertheless, in the morning, we were trying to piece together what happened the previous night, like a jigsaw puzzle. And two of my ex-students came up to me and said, "Did you see the little man running around the Indian's fire?" And I was like, "Well, no, I don't remember seeing him." And he was like, "Yeah, it was really interesting." I said, "Well, you both saw him?" I said, "Yes." Well, it must have been there. And so they kind of began to give me this description of him. And then she said, "Well, actually, I've drawn a picture." He had, like, you know, he was very small. He had these big almond-shaped eyes, and he looked really ancient. And this was the picture she had drawn of her and her friend and the little man running around the fire, with somewhat kind of elfish or alien-like features. And it was at that moment when they showed it to me, I recalled coming home on the minibus the previous night and seeing a little wizened old lady about 3 seats in front of me, peering over the top of the seats, grinning and kind of winking conspiratorially at me. And I was thinking, because I didn't know I was under the influence of drugs at the time, is she one of the delegates from the conference? I don't seem to recognize her. She looked about 300 years old and had a kind of grin from ear to ear and these large almond-shaped eyes. But I'd lost all complete rationality. And, you know, the best I could deduce was that she was also one of the delegates. So you might put that under the heading of a kind of collective hallucination or a shared hallucination, which begins to boggle the mind and begs all manner of other questions. Nevertheless, that wasn't with DMT, that was with brugmansia, but the same warning applies. So as I said, there was a researcher by the name of Rick Strassman, a medical doctor, in the mid-1990s, and he very quietly wanted to explore the nature of psychedelics on the mind and body. And he chose DMT because it was one of those substances which wasn't really well known of. It was very much obscure. It didn't have all the kind of connotations attached to it that other psychedelic substances did. And he was able, after lots of effort, to get some approval for the ethics and the government to do this research. And because of the intensity of the experience and the mystical-like qualities of the experience, he put forward this idea that it tended to parallel the near-death experience and may actually be part of the explanation or the key to understanding the near-death experience. And that is because not only is DMT the most potent psychedelic known to humanity, it is also endogenous to the human body. That means it's naturally occurring in the human body, unlike all other plant-based or synthetic psychedelic chemicals that we know of. So we make DMT in our body, and it's also found very broadly across the whole mammal and animal kingdom, apart from in insects, it would turn out. That's probably something to do with the reason why people see them doing weird operations on them. And fungus, but fungus have their own version. It's called psilocybin, also known as magic mushrooms. So DMT is ubiquitous. We find it nearly everywhere in nature and even in humans. So what is its function and role in the human body? We don't know. And Rick Strassman was kind of the first to speculate that it could underpin these profound mystical transitional processes, such as the process of dying or near-death experience. He also suggested it might account for mystical experiences like cosmic consciousness. If they are spontaneous, it could be triggered by DMT, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, and of course, alien abduction-like experiences. Not to say that these aren't in any way genuinely mystical, but to say this is part of the neurochemical process, perhaps, when people have these experiences. So some of his evidence was taken from the indigenous use of DMT in the Amazon jungle, which is found in abundance in plants like chacruna here. However, DMT, if you try to ingest DMT, it isn't already active. There's enzymes in your body, in your blood and in your stomach called monoamine inhibitors, MAOs, and they block the action of the DMT. So to make DMT orally active and get it to your brain, you need to have an enzyme which can inhibit the other enzyme. You need something to block that enzyme. And so they mix it with another plant. This is the Shuar Indians. They mix it with a plant called ayahuasca. There's a picture of DMT. There's the plant, there's chacruna again. It's doing the rounds. And there's DMT again. I seem to be going around in circles. Okay, so DMT, as I said, is strictly similar to serotonin. There's the ayahuasca vine. So they mix it with the ayahuasca vine, like this. So this one's a bit old. And the ayahuasca vine itself contains chemicals which block these enzymes in your stomach, which stop the DMT from happening. And these are originally, later determined to be harmaline and harmine, but when they're originally isolated about 100 years ago by a Colombian chemist, they were named telepathine on account of all the explorers and botanists that encountered ayahuasca in their travels in the Amazon all had stories of, typically of a clairvoyant rather than telepathic nature, of going some distance and seeing what was happening at a different location, and usually determining that somebody they knew was either dying or dead, had just died, when they didn't have that information already. And there's various accounts of this happening from various explorers. So it was perhaps aptly named telepathine when it was first discovered. So there you go. If you mix the two plants together, ayahuasca vine and chacruna, one with DMT, one with these MAO inhibitors, which stop the enzymes in your stomach, they mash them up together, they put them in the big pot, they boil it up. And now it's said that one of the theories is that the human pineal gland somewhat mimics the chemistry of the ayahuasca brew. Now, this is getting a bit technical, but you bear with me. So the pineal gland, as you know, is a very small organ in the very center of the head. And it contains various chemicals, the main one of which in daytime is a lizard. No, I wasn't expecting that. So just to say that the pineal gland is thought of, it's been kind of said to be the third eye. And in many respects, it is like an eye. It sees light and dark. It picks up information from the optic nerves, and it tells you when it's daytime or it tells you when it's nighttime, and it makes different chemicals depending on whether it's light or dark outside. And in some animals, such as the twara lizard of New Zealand, nearly extinct, it has a pineal gland on the top of its head, breaking the surface of the skin, which has a lens and a retina and a cornea. So it is very much a third eye. However, in humans, it took a slightly different evolutionary trajectory, and it's found its way into the center of our head. So there you are, the twara lizard. So yes, the main chemical abundant in the pineal gland is serotonin during the day, but at nighttime, the production of serotonin changes, picking up information of light from the eyes. The pineal gland goes into converting serotonin into other chemicals like melatonin and pinealin, and these are also MAO inhibitors. There's serotonin and there's DMT. So the other theory more recently is that as much as the pineal gland converts serotonin at night into melatonin and pinealin, it can also convert serotonin into DMT, because one of the great conundrums is we don't know where DMT is actually made in the human body, but the theory, and it's only a theory at this point, is it's actually made in the human pineal gland. So there we have it. The ayahuasca mimics perhaps the pineal gland chemistry. So at nighttime, we have in the pineal gland pinealin, which is a MAO inhibitor, which allows DMT to be active, could be mixed with the production of DMT and give rise, the theory is, to sleeping dreams or nocturnal psychedelic-like events. And that's comparable to the chemistry of the ayahuasca brew, which also contains these MAO inhibitors and DMT. So that's the theory. It's not proven, because we don't know for certain DMT is made in the pineal gland. And in fact, various commentators, like one of the world's leading psychedelic pharmacologists, Dave Nichols, was at our conference a few years ago, and he tried to dispel this myth. He says, well, the pineal gland is very, very small organ. It only weighs 130 milligrams, and it would have to contain a lot of DMT for it to be actually chemically active to give you a spontaneous mystical experience or a near-death experience. Now, that was based on a very limited data set, however, and since then, researchers in the United States looking at euthanized rats, and it's quite an unfair experiment on the rats, but they did determine some interesting things. And that is, at the point of death, they found DMT in the rat brains. And at the point of death, the amount of DMT in the rat brain increased by a factor of 6. However, they took some rats and they removed their pineal glands, and they found there was still an increase in DMT at death as well. However, it was much less than those rats who had pineal gland. So there's still some debate around this. But the interesting thing is that they found a 6-fold increase of DMT at the point of death, which somewhat supports Strassman's idea that it could be the trigger for near-death experiences. Right, I'm going to leave the science behind in a minute, just to say, so in the Amazon jungle, they make use of ayahuasca. They use it for all kinds of, insight, healing, revelation, discovery, to communicate with spirits of the dead, and to have these kind of clairvoyant-like capacities of transcending time and space, and even to do psychic diagnosis, see inside people's bodies, see cells, see organs, and so forth. That's a whole other talk. And they also paint these beautiful geometric patterns all over each other's faces that they see, which represent the sounds they see. They get rather carried away with that, as you can see. So here's some Amazonian ayahuasca artwork where he is healing somebody through song, and aided by a hummingbird. It comes and weaves the geometric patterns together and puts the man's geometrical, symmetrical alignment back into place, and that makes him better. So that kind of healing through song and discarnate entities, essentially. It's very different to the medical model, I think you'll agree. So there's some more Amazonian ayahuasca artwork. Serpents are very common. as are jaguars, and the serpent's thought to be the spirit of the ayahuasca, and the jaguars are taken to be the kind of spirit body of the shaman. So, I mean, I started conducting research on this years ago, and I was, initially by doing a survey, and I looked at people's psychedelic experiences and how common they had these extraordinary transpersonal experiences, and the whole raft of them, which are certainly much more common under the influence of psychedelics. But to just give you a sense here, the one in the middle, death, rebirth, and past life experiences, was quite common on all psychedelics, but 40% of people who'd taken ayahuasca reported having an experience of this kind. So it's pretty common to have this kind of entering in, dying, coming back, being reborn, these kinds of experiences where you perceive yourself to have died and come back. I mean, everybody comes back. Nobody actually dies from taking ayahuasca. It's very physically safe. You just have the experience. It feels like you're dying when you have the experience. And so some researchers have attempted to do an analysis of the features of the near-death experience and compare those to the features of, say, for instance, a DMT experience. Potts did a rather potty analysis, I would say. It was a bit ad hoc, and he said, well, there is lots of features of the near-death experience you don't get on DMT, such as a sense of sudden understanding, light, sensory vividness, out-of-body experiences, but actually you do get those in DMT experiences. However, he was right in identifying that there are elements of the DMT experience that you don't get in a near-death experience. Just for those of you who don't know what near-death experience is, the classic thing is, you have a life-threatening accident or incident, or at least you perceive it to be life-threatening. It doesn't actually need to be life-threatening, though it usually is. And, first thing is you pop out of your body, you're up in the, up above, looking down, you can see your body, you're like, oh dear, something bad's happened. Paramedics come along, they're trying to resuscitate you. Suddenly you see your life flash before you. You see a tunnel of light, you go through the tunnel of light, you're just about to get to the end, and then one of your dead relatives pops up and goes, oh no, you've got to think of the kids, it's not your time yet, you better go back. And sure enough, you go back into your body just as you're being resuscitated. Now that's a kind of classic near-death experience. And so it doesn't have all of the weirder features of a DMT experience. Like, people do not encounter ginormous praying mantises doing emotionless brain operations on them, for instance. So there's a lot of parallels. People may have encounters with divine beings, angels, deities are common to both experiences, but some of the experiences with the DMT can be a lot weirder, for instance. And finally, the research at Imperial, they took the near-death experience scale and they gave that to people they'd just given DMT to, and they found very little difference. Okay, so on paper, by these kind of somewhat crude psychometric measures that psychologists love to use, near-death experiences and DMT experiences look very similar, but there's a lot of nuanced differences as well, such as the praying mantises or geometric patterns, which we don't get on near-death experiences. And we don't get very many dead relatives either with DMT, but we do with near-death experiences. Apart from that, there's a lot of parallels. I won't go into that slide or that slide. So this is a word cloud of people's kind of experiences on DMT. I don't know if that means they like it a lot. So this is where they take lots of people's verbal reports and then they kind of get it to come up with the most common words that people have said and put it in a visual way. And like was the most one, but then, people say it's like, a lot. The entities came up a lot, as did felt and DMT, but eyes. I want you to just kind of notice this commentary on the eyes, because that's going to be significant in a moment. So what about the shamanic worldview? So we don't really know necessarily how to interpret these experiences. Myself and some colleagues, I gathered the greatest minds I could think of, some of the speakers at this Tuesday series, and we tried to just find out what do these experiences mean and what do they indicate. And you can read more about that in this great book I hasten to say, DMT dialogues. And there's a few theories. I'm not going to go over the theories, actually. I'm going to move on. There's some of the perspectives. But I'm going to move on. Oh, that's to my next book, in where I talk about my own personal experience, and I'll tell you a little bit about this because I want to have some time left for this. So this is going to move in. We're going to leave all the science and speculation behind, and so I'm going to start by reading actually a short passage from my book. So DMT is, like I say, it's extremely powerful. Most people take it very seldom. It's not addictive. People who take it are extremely cautious about taking it ever again. It's so profound. People do take it multiple times, but very infrequently. So I'd taken a full dose of DMT about 40 or 50 times, which is a lot, over a period of a few years. And always with some trepidation and reverence for its power. True to form, I met a variety of extraordinary entities on these excursions. Some unknown godlike beings, sometimes shape-shifting, mischievous imps, but increasingly I kept getting the feeling I was intruding upon a cosmic gathering I wasn't invited to. Sometimes the effects failed to go any further than an ego dissolution and a wild swim through a fractal geometry of pulsing light with all the usual wild array of colours. Yet often I felt as though I was being blocked to whatever lurked beyond these multidimensional geometrical dimensions and to the places I'd been to previously. A couple of times I had felt so uninvited and intimidated by the entities I did meet that I did not wish to return, regardless of my curiosity. On my last DMT experience, I'd been determined to return to the mystic bliss that I had once known, and I took myself off to a secluded beach on the banks of the river Ganges. I prepared myself with an improvised ritual, hoping to gird myself against whatever lay beyond, and inhaled a pipeful of the foul, plastic-tasting resin. Sucked into the space between the pipe and my brain, I found myself breaking through the veil like a gatecrasher at a party of swirling, smiling eyeballs, all attached to snake bodies, which were as startled to see me as I was to be there. The whole ordered assortment of eyes and snakes acted as one being. And in a brief moment before I reacted to my arrival, I managed to glimpse over what you could loosely call the shoulder of this strange being, and instantly realized I had seen something that I should not have. A brief glance at the truly forbidden. Afterwards, I couldn't recall what it was exactly, having somehow blocked it out, but only recall that it was a scene that seemed both ineffable and highly illegal for mortal minds. But then the multitudinous eyes of the being before me quite quickly and quite deliberately blocked my curious consciousness explorations any further by mesmerizing me with its squirming, rhythmic, geometrical eyeball hypnosis. I mean, this thing really scared me. It acted with utter surprise at my being there, and then, alarmed, the ominous, luminous, voluminous numinous had proceeded to let me know that I should not be there, and that I should certainly not be peering into the hallowed space beyond it, which it clearly guarded. I opted not to defy this terrifying entity and attempted to remain as passive as possible while it pulsed and gyrated intimidatingly at me for the next 10 minutes, though it seemed like an eon. So that was my experience, and that was the last time I took DMT, well, at least for about 14 or 15 years anyway. I've since been injected with DMT in the university laboratories for the name of research. So that was, a really intensely powerful and somewhat terrifying experience, which put me off ever taking DMT again, as you might imagine. So at that time, I was doing some research with a colleague of mine, Dr. Serena Roney Dougal. She was doing research on psychic abilities of Tibetan yogis. and she was over in India, and I'd come across a book rather randomly on my bookshelves as I was tidying up called The Cult of Tara, Magic and Ritual in Tibet. And I didn't think I was going to read it, so I thought I'd send it to her. She'd make better use of it. But before I did, I just had a quick flick through the pages, and I encountered this being there as kind of detailed as the ancient protector Tsar. So Tsar, it turns out, I was quite intrigued because he has this kind of snaky body and he's got eyes all over his body. And it was like, it suddenly triggered, you know, some nostalgia, let's say, for my own DMT experience. He says, Tsar is known to appear with half the body of a snake, no less, and is covered in 1,000 eyes. Interestingly, like the cherubim, the guarding the ark, the Tibetan Tsar functions as a protector of the law and is a guardian deity belonging to a class of demon gods called the Lu, or Lamayin, who appear with snake bodies, otherwise known as, perhaps in the Indian tradition, as Nagas. So in this book, it goes on to say, these Lu are indisputably spirits of the underworld, found in places where their realm impinges upon ours, such as in springs, wells, and rivers. As you can see here, there's a river. I happened to be on the banks of the river Ganges, close to the Tibetan border at the time of my encounter with this thing with the snake body and the eyes. And I was like, this is getting quite curious. So, you know, I carried on reading, and he refers to a book by a Polish researcher on Tibetan demonology called Nebebski Wojtkiewicz, I think that's how you pronounce it. He said that these deities guard the religious teachings, and that the 1,000 eyes watch the happenings in the three worlds. And he said that, you know, they're not to be tampered with in the same way you wouldn't really tamper with the workings of a television set. You have to kind of leave it to the ritual experts. And I was at this point, I was a bit concerned, particularly when one of the next pictures in the book, there's another image of Tsar, the protector deity, this kind of guardian of the sacred knowledge in the underworld. There's a book by Nebebski Wojtkiewicz. I can't actually say that. And this is one of the images from Nebebski Wojtkiewicz's book. And it says here, because of, you know, the kind of the power of these deities in Tibetan mythology, he said that they make elaborate propitiatory dough cakes made to honor Tsar. And it's constructed of a large red serpentine pyramid dotted geometrically with numerous eyes and bearing stakes. Now, my own kind of experience of all these snakes and eyes took on this very, very geometric dimensions. They all kind of morphed together and started moving very geometrically in a hypnotic way. And so this kind of struck a bit of an accord. And it said the stakes arranged around the base of the Gautama, on which dough effigies of men and animals have been impaled as offerings. This is the point I started getting rather concerned. But not that much. Now, so simultaneously, I was conducting the survey I'd shown you earlier when I discovered this book, and I was starting to get, so I put out this big survey of people who are taking psychedelics to talk about their paranormal-like experiences, and had all kinds of people reporting all kinds of things. But one of the ones in there was quite curious. So somebody in my own survey had said, I was convinced I was dying. This was on DMT. I said, I was convinced I was dying. I saw another dimension, one filled with eyes in a Fibonacci vortex dome. And he says, I've explained this to so many people, and regardless of how many things I see, be it in art or biblical references, they all say I'm nuts, which gave me a little bit of relief, but also a little bit of extra concern in that they'd had something very similar to me on a DMT experience. And in fact, I did some more research. I came across another survey of people's experiences on DMT. And again, people talking about encounters with things covered in eyes, which look to be like snakes or tentacles of some variety. And there's a website on the internet where people have posted up over the years all their psychedelic experiences, and there's a vast library of them which you can do a search on. And if you look up eyes and snakes and DMT, it actually comes up with a lot of encounter experiences. And I won't bore you with all of them, apart from one, which hopefully won't be too boring, which kind of sums up all the rest. And it goes like this. So I remember the veil like rubber or surface of jelly stretched out in front of me. I leaned forward to touch the surface of the membrane, and then what happened next, I swear, nearly killed me from its sheer bizarrety. A creature emerged. It was not a happy, smiley elf. Oh no, it had innumerable tentacles, like a cross between some weird octopus or jellyfish, and this, capitals in the original, the eyes, oh my God, the eyes. I froze on the spot thinking, that's it, I've gone and done it, now I'm toast, I never believed, I should have believed, and now I'm at the mercy of something much, much bigger and complex and clever and definitely more malevolent than myself. I asked its name. I wish I had not asked. Its voice utterly destroyed me. It was like being caught in a storm of psychic noise, a whirlwind of deadly electrical shrapnel with its innumerable eyes. It gazed at me steady and extended a tendril. At the same time, it fired a beam of light directly between and above my eyes. The laser was pinkish green. It hurt. I begged it to stop. I whimpered, please stop. You're hurting me. I'm fragile. Please be careful. I am sentient and mean you no harm. It seemed to consider this. The laser was withdrawn, but the tendrils, there were more now, were still in place. I was trying to make out the details of its shape or structure, but the closer I looked, the more it slipped away from me. It seemed to tell me in some weird non-verbal fashion not to struggle, to stop making noise with my eyes. I took this to mean be calm, don't struggle, clear your head, see, but don't look. The tentacles had no substance as I know it, and the eyes were the most awe-inspiring, terrifying thing I have ever beheld. They defied counting, they defied reason. The whole thing was too much, and I felt myself losing my mind. And this in the original, I just lost it, gone. That's exactly how they wrote it. So I saw, I mean, it's somewhat slightly comical, but I saw a lot of parallels with my own experience. And this rather started beginning to intrigue me, because it wasn't just me. There was like numerous people out there had this encounter with this thing that you turn up, he looks quite surprised. He's like, what are you doing here? You're not going to be here. It's covered in like lots of either legs, tentacles or snake bodies, covered in numerous eyes, and goes into this kind of, does this kind of weird hypnotic thing on you to tell you you really shouldn't be here looking at this stuff. And supposedly appears in Tibetan mythology as well as this guardian deity. Now it's no accident either, perhaps, then, that the book cover of Rick Strassman's book about DMT and near-death experiences has this piece of artwork by Alex Gray, who's inspired by his own DMT experiences. And this piece of artwork is called Dying. And it shows this Fibonacci spiral, quite literally a Fibonacci spiral of eyes, which certainly resembled what I experienced, except for it was extremely sentient, but you can't really kind of get across in perhaps in the painting. And there's the cover of his book there. There are various other kind of connections as well. I did some research. Some occultists came up with some accounts of how Tsar, it doesn't just appear in Tibetan mythology, but characters very much like Tsar appear in mythologies all over the world. For instance, they relate him to Azazel. And here's a kind of picture from a kind of comic by, I think it's Neil Gaiman, called The Sandman. And they depict Azazel here as this thing with all these innumerable eyes, which has had some kind of appeal. But also in my research looking at different mythologies, you find these characters with similar features popping up. Now, the original story of Tsar in Indian mythology is this kind of like Promethean-like character who steals the divine nectar from the gods and is kind of punished by Rudra when he finally catches him. having drank the divine nectar, Rudra kind of cuts him in half with his thunderbolt, and this serpent body grows out because he's immortal. And then he carries on cutting him, and everywhere he cuts him, eyeballs appear. And that's how Tsar ends up looking like he is, because he's been a bit naughty, and he's kind of taken the Promethean fire from the gods. And we see similar characters across all different mythologies. Azazel, the Watcher, the serpent of the Garden of Eden, Azrael, the angel of death from Islamic tradition, who's seen with the 10,000 eyes, Azza Shemyaza, the Persian angel, who swapped the name of God for sexual favors, like you do, Azhadaha, the Persian black serpent, angel of light, leader of the fallen angels, known as the Watchers, the ones that watch, Zahak, Azidahaka, and so on. So we see, and they all have this kind of similar etymological root as well, you'll find. So the kind of personalities are slightly different and the appearances are different, but there's usually always some combination of serpents, and or they have lots of eyes, and they have these kind of Promethean-like characteristics of, you know, kind of stealing some wisdom from the gods and trying to give it to humans. And interestingly, in Arabic and in Hebrew, the two letters A and Z, which pop up in all of these names, Ayin in Hebrew, or Ain in Arabic, means eye. And Zain, or Zain, is the sword, this kind of super cosmic sword, or this kind of lightning bolt. So it wasn't, I started finding these kind of occurrences everywhere then after this point. This is from one of the very first experiments using psilocybin mushrooms in France, actually in Paris, the 1960s. And one of the subjects drew this thing called the many-eyed dragon. And it's then a kind of, one day I was just inspecting a pine cone, and it was like, it occurred to me, it's like, wow, it's got this kind of geometric Fibonacci spiral over it, and appears to have what look like eyes. You know, it's not too dissimilar to the thing I saw or thought I saw. And in fact, it seemed to have some characteristics resembling some of these depictions of these kind of transmythic entity with these eyes. Looks somewhat like a pine cone, or the multi-eyed dragon, or the propitiatory dough cake from Tibetan mythology. And the interesting thing about these pine cones is they have a Fibonacci spiral that way, which is exactly the same as a DNA helical structure, but on the bottom it looks more like that, which looks just like that, which is this kind of Fibonacci spiral of eyes, depicted in this painting of death or dying. The really interesting thing, of course, about the pine cone is that the human pineal gland is called a pineal gland because it's shaped like a pine cone. Now, this starts getting really in some very peculiar territory. And I was trying to kind of, well, make sense of that. And was I somehow having a vision of my own anatomy, that of my own DMT producing mental organs? I don't know. I mean, but it gets very peculiar, and we see evidence that, you know, the ancients in ancient esoteric traditions had knowledge, it seems, of the pine cone. So, you know, the staff of Osiris, the Thyrsus, and of course Osiris was the lord of the underworld, has this kind of staff, two serpents going up either side, two snakes, and it's topped with a pine cone. Which is somewhat resemblant of the tantric or Vedic traditions, where they have this central shaft of energy and these two kundalini snakes going up either side, and the central column culminates at your Ajna chakra, which is the kind of esoteric equivalent of your physiological counterpart of the pineal gland. But we see this quite a lot. It carried on from ancient Egypt to ancient Greece with Dionysus, and even Bacchus in Rome. It didn't get much further than that. It stayed in Rome, but it never went away either. There's JP2 with this pine cone. In fact, in the Vatican, if you've ever been to the Vatican, you may have noticed, because it's hard to miss, the biggest statue in the Vatican. And just to give you a sense of it, somebody standing there would just about come up to the top of the railings. Is a ginormous statue of a pine cone, and I'm not sure what it's doing there. Anyway, so being familiar with psychedelic visionary art, it's almost like every psychedelic visionary artist, like Alex Gray in his Picture of Dying, have created paintings of serpents with eyeballs all over them. It seems to be a very common motif, which pops up a lot. So much so that one of my colleagues, I helped him do some analysis, was doing some research in South America with people, Westerners, taking ayahuasca, and he gave them this simple creativity task of these empty circles, and he expected them just to draw the usual geometric patterns. But what he found out, when people took ayahuasca, they tend to draw afterwards significantly more eyeballs. You know, eyeballs became a new category beyond the geometric patterns spontaneously when people have ayahuasca experiences. So it's very, very common to induce this sense of having experiences of seeing lots of eyes under the influence of ayahuasca or DMT. And at the recent experiments at Imperial College, these are some of the pictures they obtained from the participants who had been injected with DMT. I was one of those subjects as well. That isn't my picture, however. So this is two pictures from the same subject. So lots of eyes forming geometric patterns. And then this is their next picture. Then from the geometric patterns and the eyes, this thing emerged with these kind of tentacles. So it's not an uncommon motif. And in fact, in our own DMT research at Greenwich, we studied about 30 odd people taking DMT in their own house. And about the 10th person we encountered, he took the DMT and he came back from it, and we got them to draw a sketch and tell us about their experience. And he said, I thought I was dying at the beginning. He said, I thought I was dying, and I saw this thing which kind of filled my visual space. It said it was like red colored background, and it was an oval covered in eyes. And he said it was terrifying, and he thought he was dying. Right? And he had no knowledge of my own particular avenue of research. So, you know, the connections go on and on. I keep seeing this stuff everywhere. I could probably tell you stories all night, but I'd just like to, you know, remind you that eyes do tend to pop up a lot in DMT. It's a very common experience. There's even a letter, a glyph in the Cyrillic alphabet called multi-ocular O. It's depicted as a geometric kind of hexagonal picture of lots of circles with dots in between, which represent eyeballs. And it's only used in connection with the many-eyed seraphim. So it even has its own letter in some languages. But I'd like to open up for questions. So I'm going to finish off by saying, and there's one story, if I get a chance, I'd love to tell about a small child at the age of 5 who terrified me one day by telling me he basically used to go down to the underworld every 8 days and hang out with this being covered in thousands of eyes and had all these snake bodies. And sometimes he would form one snake. Sometimes he would go off and form lots of different snakes. And he said he was like looking after all the souls of the dead. And he told me that the reason he had so many eyes is that he had a near infinite number of eyes because he had a near infinite number of souls to look after. And, you know, sometimes the little boy would help him. It was a very busy man, he said. He had a lot of souls to look after. And sometimes, you know, this thing with the eyes and the snakes would tell him jokes. But he would go and see him every 8 days, he said, in this hypnagogic phase between waking and sleeping, because he said he knew he was going there because he would see all these geometric patterns would emerge, which would be the inverse when he came out of the dream in the morning. This was a 5-year-old boy. And he also told me something that nobody else knew about my encounter experiences, which made me think at the very least he was telepathic, or he was genuinely having these encounter experiences because there was no other explanation. It wasn't like anybody could have put him up to this. So I'm going to leave you with this brief poem by Bourdillon. The night has 1,000 eyes and the day but one, yet the light of the bright light dies, world dies when with the dying sun. The mind has 1,000 eyes and the heart but one, yet the light of a whole life dies when love is done. I'll leave it there, and I'd love to hear some questions or comments if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, David. That was fascinating. And there are already a lot of questions to get through, so we'll get straight to it. We have Peter Bruin, who is always in our chats and our Tuesday talks. He says, atheist conversion, anything that works the other way?
I don't know if there is any kind of like an atheist creating, converting device. Not as effectively as that usually, as far as we're aware. I mean, what we seem to find with psychedelic substances is that people shift both their kind of spiritual religious beliefs, but metaphysical beliefs more generally. And it's usually in the direction away from materialist reductionism, primarily often in the direction of dualism or kind of panpsychism. But, it also happens to have profound effects on atheism as well. Mm-hmm. So I think people get a sense that there is a tangible, mystical or other reality beyond their everyday experience. It's hard to imagine how you could do that in reverse with a kind of psychoactive agent, but I'll let you know if I find one. It's a great question.
Well, that leads into the next one from Gavin, who was talking about the survey you showed us earlier. And he asks, how did the survey distinguish between a mythical being encounter and a divine being encounter? What would, say, a meeting Zeus count as?
Oh, Zeus would be mythical, but, it was kind of down to the individual, I would say. I can't recall now. That was about nearly 20 years ago I did that survey. Yeah, but there were there were little depictions with it, kind of examples, probably like e.g. Zeus. Mm-hmm. So I guess Zeus kind of counts as a bit of divine and mythical. So as they often both do.
Vicky Wade asks, any experiments of DMT where imbiber exposed to higher electromagnetic background or negative ions?
No, I mean, there's been so little research done with DMT, largely because it's, a Class A substance.
Yeah.
You can get a lifetime in prison for supplying it, and or even 7 years in prison just for possessing it, which is somewhat ironic because we all have it in our body all the time anyway. So it's very difficult research. It's been very limited, and the electromagnetic dimensions have not been explored. Although I have put forward some theories alongside with Serena Roney-Dougal that electromagnetic fluctuations and sensitivity could be somehow key. So you're on the right tracks. There's a paper in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research we put forward that because the human pineal gland is sensitive to even geomagnetic fields, like very, very weak electromagnetic fields, natural electromagnetic fields, that could be somehow trigger the production of DMT. So you're not too far off base with your idea and your thinking there, but it's far from being researched as yet.
Mm-hmm. So then Luke also asked, just leading off of that, in your opinion, has DMT caused a net good or net harm for those who take it? And following this, should it be an illegal or a legal drug?
Well, so I think undoubtedly most people have very profound and positive experiences. Now, with all psychedelic experiences, it really depends on, well, initially the substance, its purity, it's the dosage, getting the dosage right, but also the psychological components are probably the most important. So setting, your psychological framework at the time, the environment you do it, the preparation you've had, and then how you integrate it afterwards. And in a clinical context, we've found that if you pay attention to all those factors, the majority of people have positive experiences. You very rarely have people who regret the experience or have a psychotic episode. They may have a kind of challenging time during the experience, but most of them come back and the vast majority of them find it extremely positive. So much so, for instance, with psilocybin, that it's been shown to have massive clinical efficacy in treating depression, anxiety, end-of-life fear, with people with terminal illness and so on and so forth. So I think that, that on balance, the effects are far more positive than negative. DMT is a slightly different character because it's so intense and powerful. So most people may only take it once or twice and not tend to go back there. And as to the legality, well, they are in the process of being reclassified, largely because of the clinical trials are showing they have such huge potential medical value within psychiatry primarily, but elsewhere too. And for instance, psilocybin's just been fast-tracked by the FDA in the States, so that can be licensed as a medicine within the next 2 or 3 years. So yeah, things are changing to make these things accessible as medicines at the very least.
I suppose your research is helping with that as well, isn't it?
A little bit. Mine's a bit more kind of more ontological questions. Yeah.
We have Teresa here asking if there is a way that we can increase our production of DMT through nutrition meditation.
Well, there are lots of people that speculate that you can. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot. I mean, I guess we know what the precursors to DMT are, like tryptophan, tryptamine, which are, found in the diet. They're essential parts of the diet. So yeah, potentially you could affect your DMT production, through the diet. But so we know the chemical chains that go through, but we don't know, for instance, exactly where it's made or, under what conditions. So there's a lot we don't know. But there are some potentially dietary implications, yeah. But nobody really knows because it hasn't been researched thoroughly.
Right. Well, does DMT, in your opinion, does DMT expression at night influence our dream experience? And does the amount of it determine those who dream or recall their dreams more easily?
So that was the original theory by Jace Callaway in 1988. He said that, DMT is made in the pineal gland, and in much the same way that melatonin and the pineal gland controls sleep, because your pineal gland determines when you sleep, that the DMT that potentially is made could trigger dreaming. So that's the theory. It's not really been tested. And I think it's an interesting, and I like that theory, but dreams are somewhat different from DMT experiences. There's some parallels, they're kind of quite visionary experiences. But you don't tend to get intense geometric patterns and extra geometrical dimensions with dreams, for instance. And I think actually datura, the thing that we all got given in Brazil, and I found an elf on the minibus with, I think that is actually a better simile for a neurochemical explanation of dreaming. But that's a whole other story.
Well, this next question from Teresa is quite interesting. She says, from Strassman's book, I recall people taking DMT, encountering aliens, surprised to see humans, stating they didn't realize we, humans, had developed the high level of technology yet. Do you have any thoughts regarding this?
Well, the one thing about all these experiences is they are like tricksters. These elfin characters are kind of classically tricksters in folklore. And it could be that the elves or / aliens we see of folklore are the same elves / aliens that people encounter on DMT. So presumably the folkloric ones were spontaneous through perhaps people's own DMT production. And these are kind of induced through people smoking it. But they are tricksters. So, they have a potential to say all kinds of things. And there is an interesting whole kind of discussion and theory that actually, modern day aliens or alien encounter experiences or alien abduction phenomena are just the modern version of the elves and pixies of folkloric accounts, such as, Evans Wentz and so on and so forth. So, don't necessarily trust what the elves or pixies or aliens say to you, but that's a nice story anyway.
Well, going back to that, Peter, who asked our first question here, also says DMT operating table experiences are very and totally similar to UFO abduction experiences. Where are you, Peter? Would you be able to, do you have any more questions on that?
Not really. I was struck by that, and I was also struck by the since I'm googling it now, all the serpent worship, iconography in the Vatican, which I was a bit aware of already, but I'm seeing more of it now. I'm going into it.
I wasn't aware of that either, to be honest with you. I thought it was all about the pine cones.
No, there's check it when you go back. It's choking with serpent stuff.
Right.
It really is. If you look at St. Peter's Basilica, you've got the serpent columns going up. And Bernini was the sculptor who seemed to take a lot of that hidden knowledge and place it in a place where it possibly shouldn't, or maybe it should have been.
I'd love to hear some more about that, Peter. Maybe you could drop me an email.
I'll send some stuff. Yeah.
But you're right about the kind of similarities between the alien abduction phenomena. I mean, there is a kind of like, if you were to draw Venn diagrams, if you're partial to drawing Venn diagrams, which I quite like, if you had DMT there and near-death experiences here and alien abduction experiences here and maybe even shamanic initiations here, I think they would all overlap quite a lot. There'd be kind of bits which are unique to each of those experiences, but there is a lot of commonality and parallels as well. Now, I don't think like DMT necessarily explains them all. I don't think it is the key, but I think it may be part of the explanation. And I think, so I've got a PhD researcher, he's doing his thesis on the parallels and differences between DMT and near-death experiences. And it started to touch on alien abduction phenomena as well. But it hasn't really been done to any kind of great depth yet. We'll have some information on that soon, but yeah, there indeed are. And I think it's a kind of like a collective nexus of experiences. Now, I'm not saying DMT necessarily causes those, but the experience of DMT certainly takes you to some very similar places where you may have elements of an abduction-like experience or a near-death-like experience. It's basically perhaps another key in the mind to accessing these other realms of experience, whatever they may be.
It might not be the place to ask it, but I'm really interested in how you actually are allowed to deal with what are otherwise prohibited substances in your researches, and the amount of politics that are involved in achieving a practice in that.
Well, it's changed a lot particularly in the last decade, because of a lot of the clinical research is coming through and showing that they have massive potential. For instance, in the treatment of tobacco addiction, they were shown to be like 10 times more effective than the next best tobacco cessation treatment, or that 2/3 of people in the depression studies have reduced depression symptoms up to 5 weeks later with just one dose of psilocybin. So they're shown to be extremely effective relative to our current treatments for all kinds of psychiatric conditions and addictions too, depression, anxiety. And so consequently, the research is starting happening again. I don't personally have the license at my university to administer psychedelics to people, but I do collaborate with Imperial College, which does have a kind of government license to do that. And it's quite strict and quite expensive. But I also do lots of field research. So, I've set up a protocol where we go around to people's houses when they're under the influence of DMT and do research with them, and also work in Central and South America with indigenous tribes, lots of survey work, lots of interviews. So, you don't necessarily have to give these things to people to do research with them.
I know there's one other person in the group who's actually experienced ayahuasca in situ, so I don't know if he's willing to come forward and talk about it.
Well, just off of that, there is another person in the chat who, not ayahuasca, but DMT, says, loving the talk, David. My own DMT experience, perhaps you can contact him for some research, was certainly one of the most profound and important moments of my life. And hilariously, I have no idea what exactly happened. However, it left me with a very strong sense that I briefly entered the bardos described by Buddhists. Interestingly enough.
I mean, that pops up a lot, it certainly drives people into, exploring mystical and esoteric literature to attempt to kind of unravel or explain these things, or people immediately find parallels with esoteric and mystical traditions that they had very little knowledge of until they have these experiences. As with all transpersonal experiences, and drugs are not the only way of getting there. They are one particular route, but I think my research spans all kinds of altered states, be it with just sitting in a dark room, meditation, yoga, breathing techniques, hypnosis, flotation tanks. I mean, psychedelics tend to be the most powerful, but you can access the same place through any number of different techniques. And when people have spontaneous mystical experiences, they're often led to find like really clear and apparent, as I did myself, parallels with other mystical or esoteric traditions. So, well done.
And just moving the chat to some other things that we deal with here at the center. How does your experience and work on DMT inform your work on precognition?
Well, okay. Well, that's a really interesting question. Thank you for asking me that. So in our current, we've finished the data collection just before lockdown last year. We were doing a DMT field research, and as part of that, we were doing some basic psychological science, but we're also looking at precognition under experimentally controlled conditions, telepathy, shared visionary experiences where we had two people at the same time on DMT who either knew each other or didn't know each other, but didn't talk with each other. And then we'd take them away and interview them about their experiences and get them to draw pictures to see if there were any correspondences. That was frighteningly impressive, I would say. I haven't published the results of that. It hasn't been analyzed objectively, but just the things that people came up with seemingly independently was that both on DMT at the same time with the intention of having a shared experience were quite astonishing. Mm-hmm. But the extant data set I do have is on the precognition experiment, and we found a significant result demonstrating that when people were coming down off their DMT experience, we got them to try and visualize a future target, which was unknown to them, and they were much more successful than chance in determining a near future target. Mm-hmm. So we have some evidence potentially for precognition. That comes with a large caveat, however, because I've done these experiments a few times with LSD and with mescaline. And although I keep getting significant results, the odd thing is that in the control conditions, people tend to score significantly lower than chance, which you shouldn't get. So what it looks like is some kind of weird unconscious, what we call demand characteristic, whereby the people unconsciously are using their precognitive powers to try and please the experimenter. And I don't necessarily think it's the effects of the DMT, but that's a whole other debate. But yes, we looked at precognition and found evidence of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, then our previous chair and founder of our center, who is a medium herself, asks if it could be possible that mediums who communicate with discarnate souls without the need for substance taking are doing so because they have an overproduction of DMT forming naturally in their bodies?
It's possible. Mm-hmm. And this is one thing, there's a lot of million-dollar questions around all of this stuff. So when the first neuroimaging research, brain imaging research was done with people on psilocybin, which is very, very similar to DMT, at Imperial College about 8 years ago, they found this specific kind of pattern of activity in the brain where there was actually a reduction. There was no increases in brain activity anywhere, but there was a reduction of activity in this key part of the brain, key region of the brain called the default mode network. And that was a massive surprise. Everyone thought psychedelics, you're having this kind of outrageous experience, there's going to be like more activity in the brain. They actually found no increase anywhere in the reduction in this key hub, which is loosely associated with the kind of your ego control center. And so that was interesting. They've replicated that with ayahuasca, with other psychedelics as well. And at the same year, some Brazilian researchers found the same thing with experienced psychographers. So people, trance mediums who do automatic writing. Now, what they found is that inexperienced psychographers, you try and get people who are not skilled to do automatic writing, you actually see increases in brain activity, like they're trying to do it. But the people who are experienced and went into a trance, you saw the same activity as people on psilocybin, magic mushrooms, in the brain, which was really interesting. So there's this kind of parallels in brain activity that are going on between mediums and people and the influence of psychedelics. So yes, it could be that they are perhaps accessing their own DMT or have a particular overproduction of DMT that the rest of us aren't so lucky to have.
We also have Gavin Ritchie here. I don't know, can we hear you, Gavin? Can you give us a wee hello?
Yes, you should be able to hear me now.
Yes, you had a question on DMT and psilocybin.
Yeah, there was a couple of things. I mean, I suppose my first question was around lucid dreaming and whether anyone had ever reported a lucid DMT trip, where the user guided their own experience in order to actively participate, say, in some psychic task, and or whether the experience was just too overwhelming to do that kind of thing. And also, it seemed to me that the terrifying encounters you were describing, it seemed as if the DMT experiments were just more hardcore than the psilocybin type experiments, where a lot of, obviously, you're trying to treat anxiety and depression. The last thing you want to do is propel someone into a universe filled with eyes and tentacles.
Classically, yeah.
A lot of time spent creating a relaxed setting. Is that fair to say that the DMT stuff comes with a bit more of a health warning for the participants?
Okay, I'll answer your last question first. So DMT hasn't yet been studied clinically for its potential efficacy. Ayahuasca has been looked at, but ayahuasca is different because it's a drinking brew. It has a different mode of action and lasts, like 4 hours, 5 hours, and it's much less intense and it's much more gentle and prolonged. Whereas DMT, smoking DMT is like a 4-hour ayahuasca experience condensed into 10 minutes. And so, part of the law, LORE, around psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is, during the experience, the journey, people are able to explore, past traumas or inner conflicts or their unconscious and work through that material, in 10 minutes, where you seem to experience the entire universe and back, it doesn't feel like there's much time there for any kind of personal story to kind of to evolve. So it's thought, it wasn't, classically thought it's not got many clinical applications. I don't think it's necessarily, I think it may do some good for people with, I think it is certainly more than intense than psilocybin. You probably need a bit more forewarning, but there are now 2 or 3 clinical trials just about to go underway looking at DMT as a treatment for depression. One in the UK here, which I've been advising on, and they're going to start with a small dose and work their way up, obviously. So, it may have some potential therapeutic value. As to the lucid dreaming dimensions and being able to take control of the experience, well, you're right, it is very intense. So to give you a sense of it, we did this kind of experiential typewriter kind of thing. So when people were under the influence of DMT, we would leave them to it, except for every 1 minute, we would ask them, on a scale of 1 to 10, we'd warn them about this and we'd train them. Is it on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is your experience right now? Where 1 is normal and 10 is, the most intense thing you could ever possibly imagine. And, for the first minute or 2, sometimes 3, sometimes even longer, most people wouldn't say anything. They just didn't respond. Some people would laugh. Occasionally people would go 11. But often people were just completely incapacitated. It's like, it's so intense, it goes off the scale of what you can possibly imagine. And then it kind of, quite quickly comes down over the space of 10 minutes. So there's not much opportunity for taking control of your experience in the initial breakthrough. It happens, you're up here, you're at 11 almost immediately, and then you start coming down. But for instance, our precognition experiment, based on what we know about DMT, we didn't get people to try and visualize the future target till they'd come down to about 3 or 4. So at the point we thought where they still were having a lot of visionary kind of experience, but it was less intense and they had a bit more kind of intentional control So, you know, I think at that point it gets a bit more lucid, but only when it's kind of coming out of it. Before that, you're just kind of at the mercy of it, really.
Thank you very much. That's great.
We also have Suzanne L, who's posted quite a few questions. Are you there, Suzanne L?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, we've got
Oh,
you.
great. Okay. I have several questions, actually. Which one was this?
The one, well, which one would you like to begin with?
Well, just say the one you've got there. I got there with all of them very, very, very. I mean, I might ask them to you at the Breaking Convention this year, in fact, if I can track you down, because I've got lots of questions.
If it's happening this year, or we don't know where or when exactly it's going to be happening, obviously, for various reasons, but hopefully.
But you asked Suzanne about the stress-induced phenomena generated from cells.
Well, no, I wondered if the whole thing could, in fact, be stress-induced, and that would explain sort of very heightened level of DMT in the sort of being generated out of the pineal gland, but not necessarily generated by it, but through it. So it's actually been generated out of the cells, because the DNA also is this sort of snake symbol, and I wondered whether, in fact, it's actually something that's coming out of and being produced by cells.
That's an interesting theory. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a molecular or kind of, you know, molecular biologist or anything, but you know, I think there's good evidence to suggest, you know, at least chemically speaking, that it's made in the pineal gland, because it has all the characteristic blocks. It's basically a very simple enzyme jump from serotonin to DMT, and so and those enzymes have been found as well, not necessarily in the pineal gland, because it hasn't been studied, because the pineal gland is very difficult to get out in a living human body. It's very difficult to get out with brain imaging, and also DMT is very difficult to research generally. So there's a lot we don't know, but you know, there are some potential sites of production. DNA hasn't been necessarily put forward, but then usually, I mean, our understanding, or my understanding of DNA is it triggers the production of you know, proteins, which when can produce chemicals in other modalities, but it's an indirect kind of chemical production facility. But certainly, you know, the work of Jeremy Narby, for instance, who was an anthropologist who went to the Amazon, he studied with the Ashaninka, and you know, after he took ayahuasca with them, his whole worldview changed, and he figured that they were actually seeing DNA in their experiences, because they draw these double helix serpents everywhere. And you know, they often talk about seeing inside people's bodies, seeing cells, and he was wondering, and they also, and so he kind of put this theory that they're actually seeing DNA as well. Maybe in the same way I thought I was perhaps seeing my pineal gland, which turned out to be a kind of guardian of the underworld. I don't know, but you know, it's like the mythological and the microscopic and the macroscopic all kind of collide in these realms. Interestingly, though, Narby, you know, even though he put forward this kind of outrageous hypothesis that ayahuasca shamans could see DNA under the influence of jungle hallucinogens, you know, should have got him kind of burnt as the heretic or thrown out of the academy. But then, you know, there are various stories, for instance, like Carrie Mullis, who discovered PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which, you know, that is used in all kind of genetic analyses. It's even used to test for COVID. He won the Nobel Prize for that, his discovery of PCR. And after he got his Nobel Prize, he basically said, well, yeah, it was this Californian surfer molecular biologist. And he said, well, I'd taken loads of LSD and I was able to fly alongside the strands of the DNA molecule at a molecular level and see what was going on. And that led to him getting a Nobel Prize, you know. So it's not completely outrageous to suggest this. It just doesn't fit with our, you know, kind of somewhat constrained understanding of science and perception. So there's a lot of unanswered questions. I think we should keep an open mind and continue to explore. But yeah, thank you for that question. I hope
I've got one more actually. Thank you. I've got one more, which was, again, this comes from the last convention, where somebody called Andrew Gallimore, he was talking about his idea of how the brain works. It was really very interesting in sort of the way the columns work, which I won't go through because it's too complicated. But he was going to start doing these intravenous infusions, which were called, I've looked it up this evening, extended state DMT, and you were going to be involved in that. Did you end up doing that?
Not yet. We've just done a first pilot just before Christmas.
Isn't it downright dangerous to try and stay in that place for such a long time?
Gallimor's got a bit of bravado. So he put forward this idea that because DMT, you don't get tolerance to it, you could work out, you could put people on a drip and keep them in an extended state in the DMT realm, in a high dose DMT state. So you could they could astronauts going out to space, they could spend a bit more time there and try and investigate the flora and the fauna and the topography and so on. So, I mean, not necessarily dangerous, but I don't think we'd necessarily, as Gallimore said, ultimately we could keep people in that state on a life support drip, for like a month or something. I think that was just a bit of bravado, but we are going to start initially by maybe extending the DMT experience to 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes initially, just to see if it's feasible and so on and so forth. But and look at the kind of potential neuroscience, that affects. So yes, it's being done. It is going to start. It's basically started. We've done the first recruitment just before Christmas, but it's back on hold again now. So yeah, it is happening, but not, as Gallimore said, for a month at a time. We're not sending people to Mars. We're just going to put them in the stratosphere for a little bit
and try and see if that's a stable environment.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Beautiful. Thank you for your question, Suzanne. And I think we're just about to wrap up. I'll just ask you one last cheeky question from Alan, who says, I live in San Francisco and would like to experience DMT. Any suggestions how?
Consult your pineal gland, as someone wittier than I once said. I think it was Robert Anton Wilson. Well, that's the kind of classic way. I mean, if meditation and yoga gets to the same place, alternatively, of course, there's such a thing as ayahuasca, which you can legally go and do in various countries around the world, such as Peru, for instance. But it is a bit of a kind of tourist, you need to do your homework really, because there's pop-up shamans and ayahuasca tea shops on every corner of Iquitos. But everything's possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, David. I hear you have a book. Would you like to give us any more information?
Oh, yes. So that was, this is my latest book. It's called Other Worlds, Psychedelics and Exceptional Human Experience. And the other book, particularly about DMT, is called DMT Dialogues, which is an anthology I've co-edited. And we've got a second volume coming out later this year. But thank you very much for having me here. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. Thank you so much.
Just before we wrap up again, do you want to talk about the course that you're starting in February as well?
Oh, yes. So it's with the Aleph Trust, who have been teaching online master's courses and PhDs in transpersonal psychology for about a decade. And it kind of stemmed from the original transpersonal psychology masters at Liverpool, and I'm doing a professional certificate course through them. It's called the Aleph Trust. You can find them online. It's an online 1-year professional certificate in psychedelics, altered states, and transpersonal psychology. It's part-time online for 1 year, and it starts in the middle of February, and I still have a couple of places going, but they are filling up very fast.
Mm-hmm. And beautiful. Lance.
Yes, I just wanted to say, as the official voice of the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, that when I got going on these talks a few months ago, and we chose to subtitle them Open Minds, it's quite a neat phrase, I think. I really wanted, and we've had several of them, but this is a supreme example of exactly this kind of talk. That is to say, mind open on the one hand to our spiritual interests, mind open to philosophy and ontology and all those things. And of course, a mind open also to science and everything. I just want to say thank you, David. That's absolutely great. And you must have seen in the chat that everybody liked it. And we really must let you go now. But thank you very much indeed. And Natalie will presumably just say goodbye to us all. But thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, Dr. Luke. We'll hopefully see you at Breaking Conventions if that's going ahead at some point somewhere online.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you very much, Natalie.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. I hope I see you all next week. And have a good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.